Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Pho, founder and editor of KevinMD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Scott Landman. He is an osteopathic medical student, and his KevinMD article is titled Student Advocacy through the Student Osteopathic Medical Association. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll get into the article in a little bit, but first off, just briefly share your story and journey to where you're at today.
Thank you again for having me. So I'm a third-year medical student at the New York Institute of Technology, College of Osteopathic Medicine, and I went to school undergrad at Binghamton University, born and raised in New York, and I'm very passionate about academic medicine, and I didn't think that I would ever get into advocacy work. But through Soma, this organization that I started off at just my school, now I'm the national treasurer. And so I love to share the experiences that I've had and help medical students advocate for themselves.
So you said that you initially weren't interested in student advocacy, but then you got involved with this organization. So tell me about the genesis of that interest.
Yeah, so I think that all clinicians and all future physicians and healthcare workers generally care about more systemic issues about their patients, but don't know how to address them. And so when I was a medical student, I found a lane of policy writing that can advocate to different organizations for institutional change. So whether it be inclusion of darker skin tones in our education, this is one of the ways that I can make a small impact that can hopefully change healthcare in the future.
Now, before we get into your article, in general, what percentage of your class would you say is interested in this entry into organized medicine?
I don't know a specific percent. When I speak to other medical students, specifically osteopathic medical students with the background of mind, body, and spirit being the core of patient care, these topics tend to be very inciting in terms of passions for bettering healthcare. So although not everyone is necessarily included or jumps in immediately, like we're all busy medical students. Some of us just don't take the time to jump into advocacy or policy writing.
So let's talk more about your experience. So your KevinMD article is titled Student Advocacy Through the Student Osteopathic Medical Association. Now, for those of you who get a chance to read your article, just walk my audience through it and share the story, why you decided to write it.
Sure. So Soma, or the Student Osteopathic Medical Association, is an organization found at osteopathic medical schools around the United States. If you attend an osteopathic medical school, the chances of having a Soma chapter there are pretty high. And besides for getting leadership opportunities from the chapter level, getting trained in the speech of policy and the writing of policy and the debate, this is where we get quite a bit of experience in professional development that you don't really think you'd expect to get in medical school. So that's kind of my way of including medical education through an external source. So this specific experience was when I participated in DO Day, so Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine, and we set up meetings with our Congress people. So I was lucky enough to get on the phone with Tom Suozzi, who is a congressperson in New York. And I had this really great experience where I was advocating for a specific bill that had to do with equity in COVID-19 research. There were so many things going on at the federal level when COVID-19 epidemic took over, but obviously from a medical student's perspective, we want to know the most up-to-date research on the different populations that we can best serve our patients. So we had the experience of asking him to co-sign a bill, and he said yes. And that was particularly powerful to me.
So take us into that interaction. So what was that episode of advocacy like when you were interacting with that congressperson's office?
So they're all very busy.
Yeah.
And especially during COVID, this was like the start of mask mandates and everything going on. So it was shifted virtual.
Yep.
So what I thought would be more minute, my experience became pretty great because Swazi was actually in an airport
Hmm.
traveling somewhere, and he popped up in the conversation maybe like 4 or 5 minutes in. And that was not the only thing that we were advocating for. So the fact that we had a specific ask that he agreed with our advocacy points and decided to make the decision to co-sign the bill, that was particularly cool.
Yeah. So, what are some of the other major issues that Soma advocates for currently?
So I would say, in terms of internally, a lot of what Soma advocates for are for medical students.
Yep.
There is a bit of historical discrimination against DO medical students when it comes to residency.
Hmm.
So both Soma and another organization, COSGP, we work in tandem to make sure that discrimination is not something that's experienced from DO medical students, who also now comprise of a quarter of the graduating medical students in the United States, and ensuring that the public is educated on osteopathic medicine, which is something pretty great that we get to do, and we advocate for our careers, which is something kind of unique that most MDs don't have the experience of doing.
So, when you're involved with Soma, is there any training involved? Like, how much guidance do you have when it comes to advocating for these issues?
Sure. So the core of Soma is resolution workshops,
Hmm.
where we get to write policy suggestions for the organization. And when this does happen, we have three major meetings throughout the year. So we have a spring meeting, a summer meeting, and a fall meeting. And we can have something called the House of Delegates, which is a collection of all of the Soma chapters, and the Soma chapters vote on what become the Soma policy. The cool part is you can see all of Soma's stances and advocacy work through the website studentdo.org. But when it comes to actual training, I think what I've learned the most is, besides for communication skills, is the way that you speak during what's known as Robert's rules. It is a format of debate that makes it equitable. So the minority may speak, but the majority can vote whether or not to continue a conversation. And learning this new language, besides for me thinking whether or not this was going to be something that I learned in medical school, has been quite a treat to be able to learn.
You mentioned earlier you're a very busy medical student, like all medical students are. Estimate the time commitment it takes to be involved with organized medicine during medical school.
I would believe that it's what you put in that you get out of it. As a national board of trustees member, I'm putting in a few hours a week, maybe upwards of like 10 to 15, maybe even higher when it comes to significant decisions such as managing the budget, voting on the budget, having board of trustee meetings. And this is, again, something I didn't think that I would ever be involved in. Take my position very seriously, that I'm representing the House of Delegates, because when the House of Delegates isn't in session, the board of trustees acts in the interest of the House of Delegates. And there's this cool like mirroring of the House of Delegates to democracy in the United States that is pretty exciting to be a part of. So, there's going to be parts of it that are going to be unfortunate, because there are times where you write policy and maybe it's redundant. Maybe that becomes the argument for the opposing side, that we actually don't need to vote this policy in. There was a policy that there's always a few that says, we've actually already have it implemented through this. And so what we try to do is, when we go to the COCA, the accrediting body of osteopathic medical schools, we try to ask for extremely specific word changes in their constitution or bylaws. And that, I think, has made me a way better communicator, because I can now advocate for myself better and advocate for patients in the future, hopefully better.
We're talking to Scott Landman. He's an osteopathic medical student. His KevinMD article is titled Student Advocacy Through the Student Osteopathic Medical Association. Scott, speaking to just medical students in general, MD or DO, in your view, why should more medical students get involved with organized medicine?
I haven't necessarily used the term organized medicine when it comes to any of this. And again, I still consider myself pretty amateur. So I'm very humbled to be serving in this position. When it comes down to it, you're not going to change the realm of healthcare and the issues facing our patients when you're in the room with a patient. It takes a larger scale to formally address some of the major issues, whether it's cutting back Medicare or the fact that vaccine distribution has been a long issue. You could see that most recently with the monkeypox distribution. And it's cool to be in an experience where you feel that you could vote and be a part of a bigger group that advocates for what ultimately is what medical students and what physicians feel are vital to public health. And I think that really sums up why I loved my experience in Soma, because I was able to make an impact in public health.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience?
In terms of take-home messages, I'm a big advocate for students. I think students, as the future of healthcare, can provide a lot of insight as to more novel ways to address some of the issues in residency, internship, medical school, pre-medical programs. And I really believe that the more that we include medical students in the process of the creation of programs, the better these programs will be preparing for real life physicianship.
Scott, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for being on the show.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.